Hello, wonderful audience. It's a pleasure to be here again with another wonderful and insightful session. You're welcome to another session of our Shifting Blame series. My name is Florence Topher, and I am the director of Mobile Web Ghana. And the American Spaces, this program is being brought to you by the U.S. Embassy in collaboration with American Spaces and American Corner Gbugba. American Spaces provide access to current and reliable information about the United States through book collections, internet access, events, and activities for everyone. So you are welcome to visit these spaces for these resources. Our topic for discussion today is a very interesting topic: gender-based violence and mental health. Facilitating this session is Nandi Ntiamwa Walker. She is a part-time lecturer at the Central University, licensed clinical psychologist, and a health safety environment expert. She worked as a psychologist intern at Kolebu Teaching Hospital at the psychiatric unit, child health, sickle cell, and fevers unit. As a licensed clinical psychologist, she has worked with Sweden Ghana Medical Center, Orphan Aid Africa, FBN Bank, Passionate Rehabilitation Center, Professional Football Association Ghana, and Morning Star School, Star Assurance, ECG, and Forestry Commission, among others. As you can see, she has extensively worked in various fields of work, and she's bringing that expertise to bear today on the topic we are discussing: gender-based violence and mental health. She was the Health and Safety Coordinator at Millennium Development Authority and was mentored and trained on the job by international experts from Millennium Challenge Corporation, a United States foreign aid agency established by the U.S. Congress in 2004 that manages the grants made to the government of Ghana by the United States government. Her role was to lead the implementation of good health and safety practices on construction sites to reduce and eliminate injuries, all facilities under the Ghana Power Compact program. Currently, she works as a clinical psychologist for Accra Medical Center and other places as well. And she has also worked with GIZ on the BISA app project. She manages corporate wellness consultancy that render mental health and wellness services for individuals and corporate bodies. And as you can see from her bio, she's well experienced and she has worked with different agencies and organizations across the world, and she's bringing that expertise to bear to share information on gender-based violence and mental health. And so I welcome our facilitator for today, Nandi Ntiamwa. Welcome. We are so excited to have you today. Please take over and give us what you have.
Okay, so good morning. My name is Nandi Ntiamwa Walker. Thank you very much, Florence, for the presentation. Very vast information. Thank you. So I would want to share my slides and then we go deep into today's topic discussion. So today's lesson or discussion is going to focus more on gender-based violence and its impact on the mental health and well-being of victims. And the objective for today's discussion, I know that throughout, as at this whole week, we've talked about gender-based violence by gender experts. So I would, touch briefly on helping you to understand what gender-based violence is, because already people have discussed it, and then also discuss the different types of violence or abuse that occurs, and then also help you understand the impact gender-based violence and the different types of violence or abuse have on victims' on the victim's mental health and well-being, and also help in identifying the various interventions available to support victims of gender-based violence. So this is how the outline is going to look like. So we are going to look at some cases, real life cases, and these are not fiction. These are real incidences that have occurred around the world, even in Ghana. And then also look at and to give an introduction, dive deeper into gender-based violence, and then a few sub sets of gender-based violence. And also look at global statistics in relation to gender-based violence, both globally and also within our local context. And then also I look at and discuss or talk about the different types of violence or abuse, mental health and its impact, and gender-based violence impact on the mental health and well-being of victims. And then we're also going to have a brief discussion on stress or the trauma cycle and how gender-based violence falls under trauma. And then also identify the psychological impact of gender-based violence and then interventions for victims of gender-based violence. So I want us to reflect on these real-life cases that occurred in Ghana. And the sources are under the presentation that is being given. So in 2019, Prince, 48 years old, stabbed his wife, Dorcas, more than 50 times. In fact, the newspaper article said 92 stab wounds were identified on the woman. He stabbed his wife more than 50 times to death in the presence of their two children, 5 and 8 years old. One of the children kept screaming and saying, "Daddy, you are killing mommy," a number of times, but to no avail. They had been married for 9 years. And even when the police did some investigations to find out whether there were marital issues, neighbors and family members said there were no such issues identified. The only thing that was identified was that the one kept complaining that as time went on, her husband started behaving funny or differently. This incident occurred at Dansuman, Shiabu. In 2013, a Ghanaian man called Meta, 38 years old, stabbed his wife Ikea 15 times, and afterward, she ran her over with his car with the belief that his wife was having an affair with a neighbor in London. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and when she was on her dying bed and the husband was arrested and in jail, he sent her a Christmas card at the hospital begging for forgiveness and blaming his actions on the devil. She died shortly after. Earlier on in this month, there were very graphic video circulation on Instagram and Facebook of a young man who was humiliated in a town in Nigeria, brutally beaten and stripped naked in Nigeria because he was caught cross-dressing, wearing female clothes. He managed to, the scenes were very bad, but he managed to escape, and he realized that even if he had not escaped, he could have been killed. But till date, the perpetrators have not been arrested. Again, this was a case that was reported, and it happened in one of the regions in Ghana, where a woman was being physically abused by her husband, but she chose to stay in the marriage for the sake of the children. One time, the husband physically abused her, beat her up, kicked her, among others, and even forced her to sit on a chair with protruding nails that he had put in the chair. She managed to escape. And her husband was very violent and very aggressive. So she confided in her friend about her marital challenges. And her friend herself had encountered these forms of abuse when she visits her friend in her house. She one day warned her friend to escape because her husband's behavior was so abnormal that she has a feeling that if care is not taken, one day he might kill her or even kill the children. So she planned her escape to Accra to live with a family member. And one day she was successful and she was able to get to the family member in Accra. That same night, that evening of the night that she arrived in Accra to live with the family member with the children, the husband committed suicide. He cut both of his wrists with a knife. His decaying body was found in their bedroom 2 weeks later by tenants. Leave to live. University of California junior Tatiana Tarasov was shot several times in her torso, that's the abdominal and vaginal area, and stabbed to death by her ex-boyfriend Poda in 1968. Tatiana broke up with Poda, and it affected Poda severely. It affected his academics and work performance, and he was referred to see a psychiatrist for evaluation and intervention. Father had previously confessed his intention to the psychiatrist. By the time Tanya lay bleeding to death in her home, at least one person knew that she was in danger, and that person had repeatedly told about the fact that she was in danger, and that was the murderous psychiatrist. And yet, neither the 20-year-old girl nor his family was warned of the impending danger. This became a very big case in the United States of America, and it led to the passing of what we call the Tarsoff Law, where health experts had a duty to warn and protect another person whom they believe their patient would commit a crime or a danger against. This popular case, which happened very recently and we are all very much aware of, is a Nigerian gospel singer who was on life support for 5 days. She passed away from clusters of blood in her chest as a result of her husband beating and forcefully kicking her. She left behind 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. She was advised several times to leave the marriage, but she was committed to prayer, trusting God that all would be well. And she also chose to stay for the sake of the children, and also with the belief that someday God will change her husband. Leave to live. So when it comes to protection, it's all about safety, the safety and well-being of others, and it looks at respect for human rights. So the principles of protection or safety values human dignity, encourages participation, promotes non-bias, and also it's inclusive for all, be it disabled or not disabled, male or female. So when it comes to gender-based violence, we have gender-based violence, we have violence against women, we have domestic violence, we have intimate partner violence. These are all used interchangeably. However, there are slight differences that I wanted us to touch on before we go into looking at the different types of violence that occur under gender-based violence. When it comes to these forms of violence, the risk is high among women and girls. This is the data from the Women's Refugee Commission. What then is gender-based violence? It's any act that results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, both in public or private life. It also includes violence against men. Gender-based violence is a violation of one's human rights and safety or security, which every individual in this world is entitled to. Violence against women is very specific. This is gender-specific based violence, which mostly occurs among women and girls. And then domestic violence, which is also referred to as interpersonal or family violence, is violence against children, siblings, couples, intimate partners, grandparents whom we share living space with. Both men and women can be perpetrators of such forms of violence or victims of domestic violence. And then we also have the intimate partner violence, which is the violence that occurs between people who are in a sexual or an intimate relationship. It can be homosexual, same-sex intimate relationships, or heterosexual intimate relationship between men and women. Globally, an estimated 736 million women, that is almost 1 in 3 women, are subjected to some form of violence. 1 in 4 adolescent girls between the ages of 5 and 19, making about 24% of this population, have been subjected to some form of violence. And in 2018, an estimated 1 in 7 women experienced physical or sexual violence, either from an intimate partner or a relative. Globally, 81,000 women and girls were killed in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, and around 47,000 of them, making about 58% of this population, died at the hands of an intimate partner or a family member. Looking at the European Union data, it says that 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence. 1 in 2 have experienced some form of sexual harassment. 1 in 20 women have been raped. 1 in 5 women have experienced some form of stalking, and 95% of victims trafficked for exploitation are women. In the United States, nearly 1 in 5 women and about 1 in 7 men experience some form of physical violence from an intimate partner. And 1 in 5 women, as well as 1 in 12 men, experience some form of sexual violence by an intimate partner. 10% of women and 2% of men report having been stalked by their partners, their intimate partners. However, the US data actually brings out something very interesting, that victims of gender-based violence, about 18% of them experience or get some form of institutional support, and about 82% do not receive such forms of services or support. When we look at the data on the left, we find out that when it comes to psychological aggression, physical violence, contact or sexual violence, as well as stalking, women are at a higher risk of such forms of violence or abuse. The Accra Regional Office of the Domestic Violence of DOFSU indicated that as of August 2020, 31.9% of Ghanaian women have faced at least one form of domestic violence, either physical, economic, psychological, social, or sexual violence. So why is that? Sometimes victims are unsuccessful in leaving. Sometimes the abusers threaten, or there's this fear of increased violence if they leave. Either they will be harmed or killed, or their children, if there are children involved, the children can be harmed or killed. So sometimes they choose to stay sick of the children. And also partially, there is this humiliation and shame or form of guilt around being a single woman or a divorcee or separated from a spouse, because society will view you more or less as a failure. If others have been able to endure that abuse and violence and have, stayed in the marriage and has been successful, how come you are an exception to the rule? You are seen as a failure, basically. And then also there's poor social support systems for victims of gender-based violence, where we find that even when you are in a form of crisis or you are being abused and you run to friends or families for assistance or support, their doors are shut in front of you, the hope that you stay. Storms of life come, challenges come, you will manage, you will cope. And then you also find out that even the institutions that have been set in place to protect such victims or keep them safe and secured do not provide the needed support that is needed. So victims also find it very difficult to leave. And then again, you realize that there's also lack of resources where victims don't even have money to take care of themselves, because maybe, for example, the one could have been a career woman, but as a result of the marriage, maybe the husband said, stay at home and take care of the children or be a housewife. And as a result of that, they lack when it comes to they be in an abusive relationship and they choose to even escape. How are they going to fend for themselves? Even if they are taking the children away, how do you take care of the children and who accommodate them, or how would you get accommodation to start life afresh? And then also there's this belief that abuse is normal. Society views abuse is normal. A little pruning, a little beating here and there, or shouting or discipline here and there. It's okay, it's fine. That's how sometimes society views it. And culturally, we see men as the heads of the house, men in authority. They are the leaders in marriages. And therefore, even if they are behaving abnormally, it is okay based on how society views marriage and the roles of men and women within the marital cycle. And even with our religious beliefs, sometimes we even have this part in the Bible that states that if your friend or a loved one hits your, smacks or slaps you in the right cheek, turn the left cheek for them. So it's more or less, we tend to encourage abuse in some way or in some form. And sometimes when it comes to even the legal systems, processing, these kinds of cases takes a very long time. And sometimes it ends up frustrating these victims, and they actually, are unable to even leave because they don't even get the needed institutional support or help, both medically or legally, to hold these perpetrators accountable for their action. And then there's a situation whereby there's this love and sympathy for the abuser. Feelings, you have very strong emotional feelings for the abuser. There's this hope for change. One day he will change. And sometimes feelings of responsibility, that constant blame game where you end up blaming yourself for certain actions or taking responsibility for certain abusive behaviors towards you, the victim, because you believe that if I hadn't done this, Kofi wouldn't have hit me or done this to me. So what are the different types of abuse or violence? We have the physical abuse or violence, sexual violence, psychological abuse or violence, controlling behaviors, verbal abuse, financial or economic abuse, and then we also have some form of our cultural systems and practices can fall under gender-based violence. So when it comes to sexual abuse, we are looking at it in terms of when one has not consented to a sexual act, when the actor or the sexual commenter are unwanted or the advances are unwanted, being forced or being trafficked for sexual reasons. And sometimes some of the violence can also have its own psychological impact. For example, being coerced or forced into oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse, violent or physical abuse that can be before, during, or after sex, forced participation in group sex or with sex with another person or even in front of children, forced prostitution, among others. And then some of the controlling behaviors that occur is, for example, the woman not being allowed to go out, being isolated from family and friends. Your every move is being monitored, even your passwords on your social handles, your abuser has them. You are left without money to even run the house or take care of yourself, among other forms of controlling behaviors exist. And these can all have psychological or negative impact on victims' overall mental health and well-being. And then also we have the physical violence or abuse, where we are looking at it in terms of internal use of physical force or power, threatened or actual against oneself or another person. So we are looking at acts of intimidation, restraint, isolation, aggression, and endangerment. And it involves injury or harm to the body by kicking, hitting, beating, pushing, or hurting someone with a weapon or any other tool or device. This can result in severe injuries that can cause disability or death or maldevelopment or deprivation. And then we also have verbal violence or abuse, where we are looking at yelling and screaming, rage, using the silent treatment, swearing and using threatening languages on victim when they refuse to do the bidding of the abuser. And then we also have the abusers there's always arguments in the house, withholding key information, continuous interrogation, criticizing, name calling, bullying, some forms of manipulation, defaming, body shaming. And sometimes the abusers refuse to apologize or take responsibilities for their actions. And then also the abusers also go a long way to actually blame the victims for their actions or acts. And then we also have financial or economic violence. And here we are looking at it in terms of where the abuser prevents the victim from earning money by be able to be independent of him or her. So you realize that the victim ends up becoming highly dependent on the abuser. And also, we are looking at it in relation to where the victim is prevented from even accessing existing funds within the family setting. And then also, you find out the majority of the time, victims of gender-based violence tend to not be economically self-sufficient. So even when they leave this abusive environment, they find it very difficult to find a job, to be financially sound, and be able to move on. And so research have found that between 94 to 99% of domestic violence survivors experience some form of financial or economic abuse. And most often than not, too, those who even end up having jobs tend to lose their job as a result of the abuse. And then when it comes to the cultural abuse, we also have certain cultural practices that makes abuse, as I stated earlier, that makes abuse seem very normal. And even we still have certain practices that we can classify as gender-based violence, because we have situations whereby practices such as tropocy still exist, where you have children as young as 7 years old being given out to maybe the traditional leader of the community for marriage. And then also, even though female genital mutilation has gone down, we still have these practices still occurring in some parts of the rural parts of Ghana, as well as Africa, some parts of Africa. So basically, when we look at all the impact of these various abuse, we realize that it also has some more psychological impact on the victim. The victim loses his or her sense of independence, dignity, or self-worth. And then the victim also ends up becoming dependent on the abuser, which leads to some form of mental health abuse, such as projections, manipulation, rage, and all the other forms of verbal abuse that we've discussed. Sometimes victims end up living in fear and isolation. And sometimes due to, body shaming and name calling and some of the abusive words or actions taken can lead to the victim developing some form of inferiority complex or low self-esteem. It can lead to humiliation, guilt, hypervigilance, and we'll go deeper into the various psychological impacts that gender-based violence has on victims. So mental health, when it comes to gender-based violence, is very, very important. The silent wound or the silent injuries that sometimes we so easily ignore, and it has very serious impact on victims. The mind is a very powerful tool, yet very fragile, and it should not be compromised when it comes to gender-based violence. It shouldn't be ignored when it comes to gender-based violence. So what then is mental health, basically? So when you're looking at mental health, basically it's positive health, where we expect that an individual is able to, gain some of abilities or gather some of coping strategies or mechanisms to be able to manage or deal with day-to-day normal life stresses. Is able to work productively and fruitfully. Is able to make contribution to his or her community positively. So basically, when it comes to gender-based violence, mental health is as important as physical health, and it cannot be ignored or segmented. So basically, when your mental well-being is positive, it goes a long way to positively affect your cognitive, behavioral, and emotional well-being. And it also goes a long way to positively affect the way you think, feel, and act, and also enables you to function very normal, how what society defines as a normal functioning as well. However, when gender-based violence sets in, people develop mental health challenges, disorders, or challenges. So it goes a long way to affect the person's cognitive, behavioral, and emotional well-being negatively. And it also negatively affects the way the person thinks, feels, and acts, which in turn affects the person's day-to-day functioning. So it affects the person's relationship with even colleagues at work, friends, and even work performance. What are some of the factors that lead to psychological or mental health challenges or disorders? So gender-based violence will fall under environmental factors. So no biological abnormality, no family history, no physical health related issue. But gender-based violence falls under trauma, and trauma falls under environmental factors, or an environmental is a stressor. And this stressor, which is more chronic and prolonged, can actually lead to, if not well taken care of and managed, can actually lead to mental or psychological challenges or disorders. And then we also have situations whereby persons who may be victims of gender-based violence may be born with some form of biological abnormality, which automatically, if there is any form of a little stress or a chronic stress, can trigger a mental or psychological challenge or a disorder. And then again, victims may also have family history of mental disorders. And therefore, when they go through any form of stress or any form of challenge or trauma, it can actually trigger a psychological or a mental health disorder, for example, mood disorders, among others. And imagining when the victim of an abuse or violence has been severely injured and it leads to some form of disability. Most often than not, people go through cycles of grief, and then it can actually lead to some form of mental or psychological challenges or disorders. So in summary, what we are trying to say here is that the psychological violence or abuse or mental and psychological challenges accompanies all the different types of violence that we have mentioned right from the beginning of this presentation. Victims sustain more psychological injuries, which we call the silent wounds or injuries, and even physical injuries. And even these silent wounds and injuries are more deadly and more harmful than we can imagine. And if it is ignored, it can get worse and affect the day-to-day functioning of victims. Sometimes even victims who have gone through these forms of abuse or violence to end up projecting the hate or the anger they have towards the abuser, even on the children, if children are involved. And the children will also go through some form of or some cycle of psychological challenges or mental health, mental disorders. So you realize that when it comes to abuse or violence and gender-based violence, it's a form of a behavior that occurs over a period of time. And the same applies to the psychological injuries or wounds. It occurs over a period of time, and if not well managed, can actually lead to severe psychological disorders or mental health disorders that will require attention. So as I said earlier, trauma falls under stress. And what then is stress? So we are programmed or designed in such a way that we are able to function normally at a resting state or at a more relaxed mode or a peaceful state. We're able to function as what the society views as normal human function. And then also, our body is designed also in such a way that it is always ready to defend itself when it identifies a demand or a threat or a pressure. So when we are faced with any form of danger, your body immediately defends itself in a rapid automatic response process called the fight, flight, freeze reaction or mode, which is what we call our stress response, basically. And trauma falls under this type of stress. Trauma is a form of danger, demand, or threat that when the body identifies it, it gathers the fight, flight, freeze reaction to defend itself. So you realize that almost all your body, your physiological systems that are designed for the brain, the survival brain to exist, are activated during these forms of trauma or stress. So you imagine yourself when you're being attacked by, or you encounter a snake, or you're being attacked by a very dangerous bear. Your whole body is prepared to either fight the bear, flee the bear, or freeze at a certain point in time and defend yourself during this form of stress. So trauma in itself, which gender-based violence falls under, is defined as a threatening event or series of events which may have physical or psychological harm on victims. It includes violence, abuse, natural disaster, war, loss of a loved one, or neglect. And what then is stress? It's any form of mental or emotional tension that results from adverse demanding circumstances within the environment. So it's basically a wear and tear of our mind and body experience when it encounters or when it is trying to cope with a danger, a threat, or a demanding event in one's life. So basically, stress is when pressure or threats or demands are greater than the resources that you have gathered to be able to fight. So as I said, trauma, where gender-based violence falls under, is a type or a form of stress. And we've also found out that most often than not, persons, victims of violence or abuse go through a lot of psychological challenges. Sometimes they have negative views of themselves, and sometimes personality also contributes to it, where we find out also that people have different temperaments, where we find out that people who are melancholics are more likely to develop mood swings as against those who are sanguines, who are always happy-go all the time, making themselves happy, looking at things due to chance. And then we have situations also whereby we have the type A, type B personalities, where you find out that those who are very aggressive, workaholics and all that, find it very difficult to cope very well with stress, as against the type B personality, where no matter the adversity, no matter the challenge, they are still in a calm state or a more relaxed state. We find out that type A personalities don't do very well with stress or trauma, as against type B personalities who are always calm in any form of adverse or demanding situation. So you find out that when people go through forms of violence or abuse, it also leads to some form of policy distortion about themselves. So they mislabel themselves. They're always having catastrophic thinking. There's always an impending doom or danger. They live in constant fear, always overgeneralizing based on a few negative events that occur in their lives. So you find out that a behavior such as violence or abuse would always reinforce a negative thought. Negative thoughts would go a long way to also create negative feelings. And negative feelings end up also creating negative behavior. So most often than not, when we are doing some form of counseling or psychological interventions, we can use interventions like the CBT to correct such kinds of distorted thoughts that we believe is affecting behavior. And we know that the saying that says that you are what you think. Whatever you exhibit outwardly, you've already thought about it, and that is how come it's exhibited out as a behavior. So when gender-based violence and its different forms of abuse and violence occurs, it always leaves its victims in a constant fight, flight, freeze, reaction, or mood. So they're always in an action mode, ready to always defend themselves from any form of harm or danger or demanding circumstance. So for example, we can look at the washroom analogy, where a very simple analogy where when you go to the washroom, water closet is there, we find out that that is the normal human functioning. When you get to the washroom, the water is always at a resting state. That's the normal human functioning. When we either put something alien in the bowl of the water closet, we are to react to it by taking an action. So you hold the handle of the water faucet and flush it down with the water, which is at a resting state. The water is the resources you have to be able to clean inside the bowl, any alien, any threat, or any danger. So that's what happens. Now, when a person a victim of abuse or violence, is somebody who would constantly be holding the water closet and then always in an action mode, constantly flashing, even when water has not resurfaced itself to clean in the bowl. So the person is constantly in an action mode. And at a certain point in time, you realize that you may not have enough resources to actually deal with the threat or the danger. And you end up becoming exhausted and giving up or letting, whatever happened happen. So we come down to look at the general adaptation syndrome of stress and trauma, where we know we have normal day stresses that we are able to identify. And then when we identify them during the alarm stage, our body prepares itself to defend those forms of trauma or stress. And then we fall under the adaptation or the safe mode, where we have built enough resilience or we have enough mechanisms to deal with these stresses. Now, I think that will fall into the exhaustion exhaustion stage, when the stress is very chronic and it's continuous and it's prolonged. It gets to a point where we find it very difficult to cope, because you may not have enough mechanisms to deal with continuous and ongoing stress. And therefore, the body actually experiences an adverse wear and tear. And it can actually lead to, chronic stress can actually lead to physiological symptoms that even medical doctors may not have solutions to, and require you to see a psychologist or psychiatrist. These are physiological symptoms that you are exhibiting. So you find out that people with gender who experience violence or victims of gender-based violence actually most of them will continuously fall under the exhaustion stage, where sometimes the trauma is so beyond them that they actually would even be exhibiting psychological as well as physiological symptoms that requires both medical and mental health attention or intervention. So just imagine yourself, a victim of gender-based violence is just as this image, where you are living in your house, you are at peace, 24/7, morning, afternoon, evening. The bear constantly comes to your house to attack you. So in a day, you are being attacked, let's say 8 or 9 times. And in a whole year, there's constant attack. So based on that, you are always on the alert because you don't want to die. And so you're always on the alert, ready for action. Persons who go through gender-based violence or victims of gender-based violence are the same as this image that you're seeing. They're always on the alert, they're always hypervigilant, ready to defend themselves from their abusers. And it gets to a point where you may not have enough ammunition or coping strategies to deal with the level of abuse and end up letting go. And then it can affect you psychologically and physiologically. So gender-based violence causes problems to victims' well-being, their physical health, mental health, productivity, relationship, quality of life can all be affected negatively. What are some of the psychological impacts? Due to these forms of traumas, people can develop psychological disorders or mental disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, mood disorders such as depression, anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorder. You can develop panic attacks or panic disorders, as well as phobias. And then again, people can end up also having suicidal thoughts and even go as far as even attempting suicide. Either they succeed or they fail. And then people can also develop what we call stress-related disorders like acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, among others. And then sometimes we are all working towards a dream or a goal in life, more positively, where we actually will find fulfillment and happiness in that dream or goal. But in a situation whereby victims of gender-based violence, they may find themselves that those dreams and goals have been destroyed or altered because the abuser was not what they believed or thought he or she was, to actually help them live that happiness, have that happiness advantage, or live a fruitful life. So people go through, sink into stages of grief and loss. And sometimes, if not well managed, can go through what we call pathological grief or complicated grief. And sometimes when they don't have enough coping mechanisms or resources, most victims of gender-based violence can resort to substance use and abuse to cope with the abuse and violence. Other forms of mental disorders that can set in can be personality disorders like borderline disorders, among others. Then again, medical conditions can set in where you have situations whereby people who are victims of violence and abuse can develop sexually transmitted diseases, can have unwanted pregnancies, as well as other forms of physiological disorders that can also lead to psychological or mental health challenges or disorders. So what fails when gender-based violence occurs? Whereas that victims of gender-based violence withdraw, there's avoidance behavior, it can affect sleep and lead to insomnia, poor attention, poor concentration, memory loss. There's constant alertness or hypervigilance, hyperactivity, panic attacks, flashbacks, and even unpleasant memories of the violence. And then sometimes, not only would the person experience psychological challenges or disorders, but also would experience physiological challenges or disorders, such as headaches, heart attack. It can lead to high blood pressure. It can lead to disorders of the stomach. It can also lead to disorders such as diabetes. It can lead to lifestyle disease can set in. Because sometimes when you're depressed or you're going through some form of psychological challenges, sweets can be a comfort zone of coping. And then if you continuously overuse it, it can lead to some form of lifestyle disease like diabetes. Sometimes too, when violence or abuse sets in, victims of such abuse or violence have reduced sexual desires, among others. It can lead to bodily pains as well as acne and skin problems, and also weaken the immune system, even making it harder to fight off or recover from illnesses. So as I said earlier, you find out that even sometimes the personalities also have an impact on how we cope with trauma. So indirectly or in summary, what it's saying is that the mind and body interact and you can't separate them. So when you know a victim of some form of violence or abuse, you also have to pay attention to not only their physiological symptoms, but also their psychological symptoms. And we also have situations whereby we know that people who victims of gender-based violence experience psychological or silent wounds or injuries that sometimes we overlook. But in terms of seeking mental health interventions, there are also stigma or challenges around them because of the stigma around mental health, lack of social support, and then also lack of education when it comes and awareness when it comes to mental health related issues. So what are some of the interventions? In as much as the Trust Law was passed to ensure that health experts would break confidentiality or privacy when they notice that their patient is planning to harm another person, the health expert has the duty to warn or protect that person by breaking confidentiality and privacy, maybe reporting this repeated acts of crime to maybe a law enforcer or warning victims of such abuse or violence. So in as much as health experts are the ones who are supposed to, this law also applies to each and every one of us seated here in today's session. We have a duty to also warn and protect our loved ones or people that we know are in danger of some form of violence or abuse. And so we ought to be each other's keeper, all aimed at saving a life. So we ought to have give a listening ear to people and not judge them. Let them trust us. Let them trust you enough to be able to share their challenges with you. And you would also direct them to the necessary help that they will need to come out of any form of abuse or violence. And then again, mental health assessment and interventions are very important. So we go through psychological, when patients come in, they go through some of domestic violence assessment just to look at the impact the violence or abuse have on their overall mental well-being. And then based on the severity, interventions are designed. So if it requires that medical intervention should set in, the patient or the victim is referred to see a medical doctor. treat a particular medical condition, among others, as the mental health assessment and interventions are still ongoing. There's a situation whereby it requires psychiatric medications. You can also refer to see a psychiatrist to also provide the necessary psychiatric interventions for victims of gender-based violence. And then again, we also design what we call the psychological counseling or psychotherapy for patients who have gone through some form of violence or abuse. Then we look at education on gender-based violence for men and boys, and also education on gender-based violence to empower women and girls. And also we think that some other forms of interventions is whereby we still need to give judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement the necessary resources needed to hold offenders accountable for their actions, and also protecting or keeping the community safe from these offenders or victims, whilst also offenders or perpetrators, whilst also supporting victims of such forms of violence and abuse. Then sometimes, as we said, victims lack resources or funding to be able to even take care of their medical bills or psychological or mental health bills. So government should, have some form of designated budget to help victims of such forms or support victims of such forms of violence. Victims of gender-based violence need a high level of social support. And this support also goes a long way to help them heal them psychologically, among others. And then also there's need for occupational therapy, because some of them may not be economically or financially self-sufficient to be able to stand on their own 2 feet to start life afresh after living in a very abusive environment. So we have to go through some form of occupational therapy where you rehabilitate them back in society, help them get jobs, help them get build some form of independence to take care of them and get funds or money to take care of themselves, and if children are involved, to also take care of the children. And then also using relaxation or mindfulness therapy for persons going through some form of anxiety disorders or stress-related disorders to help them keep calm and relaxed. And then also there are other self-care strategies that the victims who have gone through some form of abuse can go through to heal or to build a positive mental well-being. Exercises, eating healthy food, spending time with friends, doing activities that you once used to enjoy, as well as taking breaks. And then also using spiritual or religious interventions. We have a professor called Sean Acker from Harvard University finding out that some forms of religious or spiritual practices serve as a form of intervention for having a positive mental well-being. That was how the idea came around positive psychology. So meditation, gratitude, practicing continuous gratitude, praying, joining faith-based communities, being in nature, listening to music are all ways of building positive music, not negative music, are all ways of building, a strong mental health, positive mental health. And then also you can express your feelings of trauma or stress by talking about it to somebody that you trust. And also you can also practice journaling, where you write down your challenges or experiences in a journal and all that. So when it comes to providing first-line support to violence survivors, there are 4 main needs that needs to be given continuous attention. So for victims of gender-based violence, immediate psychological or mental health assessment intervention is very, very important. Immediate medical or physical health intervention is important when it is identified. And then ongoing safety and security intervention is needed, as well as continuous or ongoing support and mental health intervention is very, very much needed for such victims. And then when it comes to domestic violence centers in Ghana, we have a wide range of centers that we can reach out to. We have DOFSU, we have the DV Coalition, we have the SEGENSA, and then the CSVR. Corporate Wellness Consultancy renders such services for clients. Hospitals and facilities with psychologists and mental health specialists like Kolebu, Rage Hospitals can all provide some form of support for victims of abuse and violence. RODA, PIDA, STRAJ, among others. So these are the contact information for Corporate Wellness Consultancy, our website, our email address, and contact. So thank you very much. These are the resources. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, great.
Thank you very much, Nandi. It's been a very revealing and insightful session. And it's surprising to see that 81,000 women and girls died in 2020 during COVID. It's very revealing, and it shows the magnitude of the problem we are dealing with. It's now time for questions, and please send in your questions, and Nandi would try her best to answer your question. I have the first question from Linda Boame, and she wants to know, are there situations where the mental health of a victim of GBV can progress to a mental disorder, example, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia?
So
Nandi, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
sorry. So as I said earlier, there are some factors can actually lead to mental health disorders. So for example, there can be a biological abnormality, or there can be a family history of bipolar disorder, or a family history of, let's say, schizophrenia. So just a simple trauma like gender violence or abuse can actually trigger the onset of such a disorder. It just needs to be triggered, and then persons with victims of gender-based violence can actually develop schizophrenia and then bipolar disorder. So it's possible based on the various factors that we have discussed.
Linda, I hope your question has been answered. And there is another question. And we've seen the effects of gender-based violence, grief or loss, substance abuse, withdrawal, heart attack, panic attack, including all other forms of impact or effect of gender-based violence. Nandi, you've done a wonderful presentation, and we've all seen the statistics and insights. Why is it not possible to live? And with all these examples that we've seen, that we hear on the news every single day, it's like 3 days ago, I heard that someone cut the legs of her wife because someone bought her a drink, and he felt that the person is trying to sleep around with a woman, and she is 45, and the man is also around the same age. We hear this every day on the news. It happens. Why is it that we don't live to live?
So I think that there are lots of factors, wide range. In fact, sometimes our culture or our society also contributes to we staying, and love is a very powerful thing. Emotions, it's also very, very powerful. So sometimes it's not that easy for somebody. You built your life around someone, and build your emotions around the person. It's not that easy to just walk out of such a relationship. Others find it very easy to walk out. Others too find it very difficult to actually walk out of such relationships. And I think that sometimes too, our cultural settings and practices have some negative impact on people still staying in abusive relationships, because they will just tell you that life is full of storms and challenges. So you endure, you keep on enduring. It will be well with time. Others have been able to succeed. You will be able to do it and all that. So I think that there's this normalcy that we've given to abuse or violence. And sometimes the person says that, oh, 1 or 2 slaps or 1 or 2 beating or hitting is not enough for me to lose, so I'll still stay. And sometimes when children are involved, it becomes more complicated and very complex. And people find it very difficult to actually walk out of such relationships. And then again, even within the societal context, you still have situations whereby the environment has set up interventions to help people who have gone through some form of violence and abuse. When these people go in for support, they don't get it. And sometimes it's very difficult. Even policemen or law enforcers would come in, warn the husband 1 or 2 times, but still encourage you to stay in the marriage, because with time the person would stay. So I think that culture and our belief systems have also affected, reasons why we don't leave. And sometimes it's very complex to actually leave a marriage, especially when children are involved, a whole lot.
Sometimes it's very complex to live, and I perfectly agree that it's very complex to live. So what do we choose, life or death? Live and live. Yes.
I think that we have to always choose life. Life is better than death. So if there's an opportunity or a room for you to leave, I think it's better to leave. And I think that when we see cases, most victims of gender-based violence experience what we call adjustment disorder. For example, in a sample of stress-related disorders, you find out that as soon as you eliminate the threats, they function very normally within the society, as against those who are still living within the abusive environment. So you find out that it's also very important that as soon as you eliminate the stressor, which is the abuser or the perpetrator, in relation to violence or abuse in a relationship or a marriage, it actually helps the person to cope well, besides the person going through all the physiological, the physical, the medical, and the mental health interventions. When you eliminate the stress, some people do function very well than others. So I think that it is better to actually walk out of, a threatening or an abusive environment than to keep on staying in an abusive environment that can even end up killing you or leading to devastating psychological disorders.
And that, Nandi, I want us to take a close look at this and the follow-up question on this. The issue of children, I think that it accounts for 90% of the reason why women still stay in abusive relationship. And what do you think? Do you think that, what do you think is the effect of GBV on the children? There are two schools of thoughts, so you don't want the children to see that, you don't want a broken home for your children. And you are also living in a home that does not depict a very good example for the children. And it's also dangerous for your health as well. So what advice would you say when it comes to people who live in very abusive homes? They still stay because of the children. And in the long run, what is the effect on the children and also on the victim?
So I have seen cases where you find out that somebody, there's a victim of gender-based violence. He or she has been abused by an abuser, an intimate partner. And you find out that she's going through severe psychological issues. And sometimes you confront the abuser as to why he or she is physically abusing maybe the victim. But sometimes when you delve deeper into the minds and the brains of perpetrators or offenders of abuse or violence, you also find out that some way, somehow, there was a family history of abuse throughout their lifetime, or maybe when they were growing up as children. So you find out that when children find themselves in a very, very abusive environment, children learn or pick up what they see, basically. It can affect them psychologically, and it ends up becoming something normal for them. So if care is not taken, a child may grow up and also see abuse or violence as normal, and also continue the cycle of abuse. So sometimes you find out that we are not able to stop the violence, not because of anything, but because we realize that there's a continuity, because then we realize that we actually are implanting these behaviors or actions even within the children. So in such situations, even the children would need some more psychological interventions to help them come out of these forms of trauma, and or tell them what is right and what is not right about what they see or observe within the family context. And then also provide the necessary psychological support needed for victims. We've seen cases where perpetrators have, or offenders have actually confessed that, look, this is how I was raised, this is how I grew up. All I know is that if a woman offends me, I slap or beat her or treat her this way, but I need help to manage my anger and all that. And some of them come forward and then they go through some form of interventions and are treated. Others too, they never change. They are just the same. So I think that it's a cycle that we need to also look at. And the children are indirectly affected by these forms of abuse, and they also need to be managed in terms of their psyche and how they view their environment.
So what you're trying to say is that if you choose to stay, the children will be affected. You are sowing seeds of abuse, some form of abuse in these children, and they will also need some psychological care in the future. And so it needs to be taken care of. I want to take you back to what I call the mental health cycle. And you mentioned that the way we think affects how we behave. And if that is what it is, and which is the truth, how can we build our mental capacity? Because like young girls, so vibrant, so joyful, they don't know what is in stock for them, or a victim, they didn't expect what she got. How can we build our mental capacity in such a way that we would be able to withstand the shocks of life, which includes GBV?
So basically, I think that when it comes to how you can have a stronger mental health psyche, when you've gone through an abuse for a very long time, it's a chronic form of stress because it's been ongoing for a long time. And it becomes part and parcel of who you are as a person. So you end up looking at yourself as not worthy. You have inferiority complex, you have low self-esteem, among others. I think that persons who have gone through some form of, young girls or older women who have gone through some form of violence or abuse need to talk to specialists or experts. And then when they talk to specialists or experts, they bring out some of the challenges that they are facing in relation to who they are or how they view themselves as a person. And when you find something that is very negative, you put into the necessary interventions, even using positive behavioral therapy to help the person come out of these negative thought patterns and feelings, which also informs certain actions or behaviors. So I think that in that situation, you can also use therapy or some form of also looking at self-care, putting in place certain mechanisms, looking at life positively. Sometimes the church is a very powerful place to be because you actually build your mental psyche also looking at certain positive practices within this religious setting. So in as much as in BT says, or JC says that Africans are notoriously religious, including Ghanaians, there are some positive aspects of our religious practices that helps build our mental well-being, even for people who have gone through some form of psychological abuse, some form of abuse, or victims of gender-based violence. So you listening to positive words, what have people gone through, using meditation or prayer. Prayer can be a form of meditation, and clearing your mind of negative thoughts, and then using positive thoughts like prayer, or centering yourself on positive words like peace, love, a wide range of things to actually help you build a stronger mental health psyche than looking at viewing things negatively. Listening to very good positive music is another way of viewing the world and looking at things more positively. You yourself can actually use certain self-care strategies, as mentioned in the presentation, to build your mental well-being positively. And then if it's beyond you, you seek psychological attention as well to build a positive mental and a strong mental well-being to deal with trauma and stress.
If it is beyond you, seek medical advice or seek medical attention. And we all know that sometimes due to economic reasons, we may not be able to get therapy or seek medical advice. But the tips that she has mentioned, Andy has mentioned this morning, self-care. If you go to the church or you go to the mosque, it will build your mental capacity. Say positive things, find a group of people, say prayers, find someone who believes in you and gives you positivity, and align with the person. All too soon, we've come to the end of today's session, and we hope we can go on and on and on. And as we mentioned, this is an ongoing series called Shifting Blame Series, and we'll come to you again another time. But in the meantime, I want you to sign up to the eLibrary USA, and as you can see in the link, there is a form that has been dropped. Please sign up using the link that can be found in the comment section below. This program was brought to you by the U.S. Embassy Ghana in collaboration with American Corner Agboba in partnership with Mobile Web Ghana. And that concludes our program for today. Please follow us on Facebook, US Embassy Ghana, for more amazing virtual program. And thank you all for joining today's session. Please stay safe, observe all the safety protocols, that is washing of your hands and the running water with soap for at least 20 seconds, and practice social distancing and wear a mask in public. Till we meet again next time, I say bye and stay safe, and practice all the steps that Nandi Walker has given us this morning. And Nandi, we say a big thank you for your time and sharing very insightful session with us and all this knowledge. And we hope we'll meet again another time. Thank you very much.